Okay, so since it sounds like we've got mostly tech things kind of sorted out and we're officially in the time of the panel, I think I am going to go ahead and get started. So just so you all know, I have Discord also pulled up on a separate device so I can see the chat, but I'm not really going to be looking at it during the presentation. There's going to be like a Q&A discussion part at the end. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, talk in the chat as much as you want, but I won't really be looking at it until the end. So yeah, I'm just gonna kind of dive in. So hi everyone, I'm happy to be here with you all. I'm Nat, or Bloodmuffins, within the online and community spaces. And I'm really excited to be here and get to talk with you all about my research. Especially, I've actually gotten more and more excited over the course of the con because I've seen so many people talking about topics that I address in my research / I'm going to be looking at in studies. So I'm just really excited to share all that with you. So I'm going to be presenting on my undergrad thesis, which is entitled Life Stories of Therianthropes, an Analysis of Non-Human Identity in a Narrative Identity Model. That's why the panel is named the way it is. And I'm also going to be sharing some kind of behind-the-scenes commentary about the research as I go through it, because I feel like if you wanted the thesis, or just the information, you could just read the thesis. So I want to kind of add some more of a personal element to the presentation itself. And actually, as I say that, I'm remembering I'm going to paste a link to the thesis in the chat. So there's the thesis itself. It's free online. You're welcome to read it. Obviously, it'll go into more detail than I'll be going into in this presentation. I do just want to give like a slight disclaimer that the thesis is a few years old and it has my dead name on it. So yeah, I don't know. That part's not my favorite. My name is Nat now, but anyway, hope y'all will read that if you want to. So yeah, getting started. So this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to be touching on today. So I'm going to just kind of briefly orient you to who I am as a person, which I feel like is important given, just contextually who I am sharing this information with you. Then the bulk of the presentation is going to focus on my thesis. And then after that, I'm going to share a little bit about my current dissertation research, which is also focused on non-human identity. And then I'm hoping to have 20-ish minutes at the end for questions and open discussion. So starting out, who am I? I feel like I'm coming to you from kind of two different angles here. I'm a member of the community and I'm also a researcher. So within the community, I go by Bloodmuffins. I've been in the Therian community since 2009, but I've been most active between the years of 2010 to 2016. I've been on a ton of different forums. I would say Wearlist is my kind of home forum, but especially earlier on in the community, I sort of made it my mission to join every forum and try to be as active as possible. So I've been around several places. I did sort of take a break from the community around 2016-ish, although I continued to work on like Tumblr and social media and whatnot. I wasn't really active on forums during that time. And then recently, just within the past few months, I've kind of been returning to the community and trying to be more active again. As a researcher, I have a bachelor's in psychology, and during that process, I was able to do an undergraduate thesis focused on therianthropy, which is obviously what I'll be presenting on. And then since then, I've been fortunate to be able to enroll in a clinical psychology PhD program, and I'm about to be starting my third year in that. And so as part of that, I have started working on my dissertation, which I'm also focusing, at least in part, on non-human identity. And I'm excited to kind of give you a sneak peek about that later as well. I also wanted to share a little bit about how these identities kind of come together and how I got into focusing on therian and non-human research. As a teenager on therian forums, especially on Wearlist, I often saw people talking about how much they wanted research to be done on therianthropy. And I often agreed with that sentiment. And I remember thinking to myself often, like, yeah, that would be so cool. I hope someone does that. But then gradually that mentality shifted a little bit as I got older and took on more and more of an interest in psychology and decided that that was something I wanted to focus on in my life. I remember one day pretty vividly. I was scrolling through one of those threads on Wirelist where people were talking about wanting this research to be done, and it just kind of hit me like a switch turning on or something. Like I could be the one to do the research. I didn't have to wait for someone else to come in and do it. I could do it, given my passions for psychology and whatnot. Um, and so I sort of committed to myself that I would do that. It felt really meaningful to find a way that I could contribute and give back to the community. I've always really respected and looked up to the people who sort of take on leadership roles in the community, like setting up forums, organizing howls, documenting, archiving research. All that is so cool and so important. And it felt really cool to find a way that I felt like I could give back to the community. Um, so that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm so, so excited to be here getting to share all of this with all of you. So with that said, let's kind of dive into the meat of this and talk about my thesis study. So first, I want to give a little bit of context regarding the research state on Therian and otherkin identity at the time that I was doing this study. So like I said, I did the study in undergrad, which was specifically the 2015 to 2016 academic year. So, not that there's been a whole lot more research in the last few years, but there was even less then than there is now. When I did my lit review, there were only 5 academic articles published on otherkin and Therian identity. Um, and most of those were from religious studies or philosophy fields, which is really cool and has a lot of interesting things to say about our communities and our identities. But it wasn't quite what I was interested in coming at things from a psych perspective. At that time, there was only one study from the field of psychology studying therianthropy by name, and that was a study by Gribble and colleagues published in 2014. And I ended up sort of basing a lot of my study on that study, kind of using a lot of their methodology and whatnot. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit more as we go on. So a big thing that I did that was a little bit different than previous research was I wanted to look at therianthropy specifically within an existing identity model. So I ended up using McAdams's life story model of identity. So I just want to give you a brief overview of that. So Dan McAdams is a researcher who has come up with this identity model. It's a narrative identity model where he postulates that identity is an integrative narrative, the purpose of which is to provide unity and purpose in your life. The idea is that you're constantly interpreting and reinterpreting your experiences to create this cohesive story that leads to your identity. So this necessarily says that your self and even reality is subjective to an extent, right? It's the way you're interpreting experiences rather than those experiences themselves that's more important. So that's kind of the model. I chose this model because Dan McAdams gave a talk at my undergrad, and as he was sharing about his theory, it really resonated with some community discussion posts I had seen. I specifically remember this thread on Wirelist again of people talking about phantom limbs and kind of speculating about whether we are experiencing something fundamentally different than what other people experience, or whether a lot of different people maybe have similar experiences, but for whatever reason, we interpret those experiences as being representative of a tail or ears or whatever, whereas someone else might just brush it off as, a tingling sensation or whatever. And I think it's really cool. I've seen people have similar conversations even just the last couple days at this con about how the way you interpret the experiences makes a difference in how it fits into your identity. And then I also chose this model and this approach because it let me interview people and allowed them to share their own voices of their experiences. And I feel like that's so, so important, especially so early on in a field of research, to let people share their own experiences with their own voices rather than imposing ideas or assumptions onto them. I just feel like that's really important ethically. So that's sort of the theoretical background of my study. So my study itself focused on exploring therianthropy through the lens of McAdams's model, specifically looking at these three broad research questions. Are there common themes in life stories of therians? How are those themes interpreted by therians? And how do these interpretations appear to influence and maintain a therian identity? So again, are there these kind of common experiences among people who identify as therians? And then how do those interpretations in line with McAdams's model seem to relate to the identity itself? So I want to give you just kind of a brief overview of the method. I recruited participants in December of 2015, specifically from the Werelist and Therian Guide forums. To be included in the study, you had to you had to be between 18 to 30 years old. This was specifically to get people within a developmental period known as emerging adulthood, which is this sort of important developmental period for identity development and consolidation. And that seemed like a fitting age or time period to focus in on, given the focus of the study on identity development. So of the 25 people who expressed interest in participating, I randomly selected 7 of them to actually participate. It was recommended, given the type of study I was doing, to choose somewhere between 5 and 10 participants. And I picked a number in the middle of that to have a reasonable workload on myself as a student doing this all by themselves in a matter of months. But also to try to do as many people as I could. I really wanted to talk to a lot of people and get a lot of, hear a lot of people's stories. So, like I said, I interviewed people. These interviews were entirely text-based over Skype using instant messaging. I feel like that dates the study a little bit. But it was all done over instant messaging on Skype. And I used McAdams's life story interview to interview people. So this is an interview that he specifically made that is in line with his model. It's designed to capture a person's life story, this narrative identity. However, I adapted it to have a therian focus. And you can see that in the sample prompt on the screen, at least for those of you who can see the screen. I have the text from the high point question. The purple text is the original text from the interview, and the blue text is the part that I added to make it focused on therianthropy. So it asks to describe a scene, episode, or moment in your life that stands out as an especially positive experience. And then I added the sentence, this scene should in some way be related to your to therianthropy or to your understanding of yourself as non-human. And then similarly at the end, please say a word or two about why you think this particular moment was so good and how it relates or contributes to your therian identity. So you can see how I kind of focused in those questions on the therian experience and identity specifically. I also added a question at the beginning asking people to define therianthropy to get an idea of how people were conceptualizing the identity themselves. The interviews themselves were meant to probably be about 2 hours, but in reality ended up being a lot longer. I think doing this over text instead of interviewing people in person, I just wasn't sure how that was going to translate, and it ended up being quite a bit longer. Looking back, now that I'm further along in my career and I've had the opportunity to do more interviews and focus groups and things, I feel like it was probably kind of unprofessional of me to let the interviews go as long as they did, up to 5.5 hours with an average of just under 4 hours. But at the same time, I don't regret it for the time because it was a really meaningful experience. And I really, really appreciated getting to talk to my participants for so long, and just the level of detail that they were willing to share with me. It felt really powerful, and I wouldn't change that. Although now where I'm at, I would probably try to be a better timekeeper. Okay, so let's get into the results. That's the fun stuff, right? So this is a demographic table, just to give you a little bit of a sense of who my participants actually were. I want to note that everything in this table is participant selected language, except for the residence column. I kind of brought in residents to be based on continent so as not to potentially give away who was who. You know, we're a small community, and sometimes if people, um, if sometimes I think it can be apparent who is who based on some information. So I tried to obscure that and protect people's privacy as much as possible. That's also why there aren't stereotypes listed here. I'm going to talk about the stereotypes on the next slide, but they're specifically kept separately from people's pseudonyms and demographic information, again, so it's not really obvious who might be who. So there's a couple cool things I want to point out on here, is that I feel like it was overall a pretty diverse sample. There's a decent range of different spiritualities that I would, expect given what I've seen in the community. I think it's really cool that there are so many different sexual orientations, and specifically that no one identified as heterosexual. I know I've seen a lot of conversations this weekend about overlap between non-human identity and LGBTQ identities. So I feel like that's really cool. And my favorite part in that vein is that 4 out of my 7 participants had some sort of non-binary gender identity, which I think is just so, so cool, and is partly what inspired me to do the my dissertation research. So there's a little teaser for that, but we'll get into that more later. So like I said, here are the stereotypes of my participants. So across the 7 people, African lioness, black-tip reef shark, fox, northern Rocky Mountains wolf, plesiosaur, raccoon, striped hyena, swan, and wolf were the stereotypes that people indicated. 3 people indicated a wolf stereotype, and 3 indicated 2 stereotypes. Everyone else indicated 1. So people either had 1 or 2 stereotypes. Um, okay. So the first kind of broad theme of results I had was conceptualizations of therianthropy. Like I mentioned earlier, I did ask people to define therianthropy in their own words, and overall, people said that it was identifying as a non-human animal in a non-physical way that is important and integral to the self. And I have some quotes here that kind of exemplify that. Throughout this whole results section, there's going to be a lot of quotes from participants. So, for example, Hackett said that it is identification as a non-human animal on a non-physical level that is integral to the self. Similarly, Joe said it is the state of being a non-human animal in a human body, with the humanness experienced primarily in terms of drives, instincts, and sense of belonging, recognition, and kinship with non-human animals. And then related to that piece about how the identity is really important and integral to the self, Alex said, "My greatest regret is not recognizing how important my identity was to my being. For so many years, I saw it as a side thing. I saw myself as human first, and I tried to keep therianthropy under wraps, sort of in the closet." So, this is the second kind of broad category of results that I found, the trajectory of therian identity development. This is probably my favorite part of my results because it wasn't something I was at all looking for or expected to find, but it so clearly emerged from the data. I just thought it was really cool. I was able to lay out something like this. For something to be included on the timeline, at least half of the participants had to report the experience. So briefly, most people said that they always felt non-human, even from early childhood, like 5 years old and younger. And then that sometime later on in childhood, typically between around like 8 to 10-ish, they had a realization that feeling non-human is not normal. And this was often also associated with trying to suppress the identity. And then it was typically in the teenage years that the identity, wouldn't go away, and people tried to find answers and explanations for their experiences. So they would do research, eventually finding the word therianthropy in the online communities. And then it was typically sometime after that that people pinpointed their exact stereotypes. So I have a quote from each of these sections. So again, early childhood was this idea of people kind of always feeling non-human, and this was often associated with childhood play, playing as an animal, which Thana shares an experience of that here. Basically, I would start the story with me at about 4-ish years old in kindergarten. That's about the age that kids don't really care about socially accepted behaviors, so they can pretend to be animals and not get judged for it. I remember that no matter what game my friends and I played, I would always be a stereotype. I was way more comfortable crawling around on all fours and growling than I was on 2 feet and talking like a typical 4-ish-year-old. It was great because acting this way wasn't a big deal, it was just how I was. Then again, later childhood was typically when people realized that their experiences weren't quote unquote normal, and often people then try to suppress their identity in an attempt to fit in more. And Gray really illustrates that here. As I got older, around the age of 8, I really started questioning the world and myself. This was around the time I really started to notice that I was different. I spent some time between 8 and 12 really wondering what was wrong with me. I had different behaviors than my peers. I had different thoughts. The world I saw was not the one they saw. I came very close to an answer, but some things in my life at that time, being bullied, losing friends, and eventually moving across the country, caused me to shut all that progress out. For a long time, I completely denied all the things I'd thought about. I tried so hard to be normal and so denied any part of me that didn't fit that. I didn't want to be different, so I pretended I wasn't and suppressed an intrinsic part of myself. So then, in the teenage years, this was often, like I said, when people would do the research and end up finding the word therian or otherkin in the communities. And Joe shares their experience with that here. I found the definition of otherkin. I'm not sure what I was thinking because at that moment I'm actually convinced I wasn't thinking. Lightning struck. It was like having a blinding flash of light, like a nuclear explosion going off, only mind wise. Instead of seeing it, it was something that went through my actual consciousness, my actual mind. The only coherent thought I managed was, it all makes sense now. The only thing I felt was being caught up in a nuclear blast of a rush. It gave me the first significant feeling of belonging somewhere and being something definite. I guess you could say that's the day where I gained an actual identity and became fully aware of it. At the same time, I also became fully aware that I wasn't human. This quote in particular has really kind of stuck with me over the years. I feel like Joe describes this experience so vividly and it feels so relatable, that I've found myself thinking about it a lot. I just feel like they really articulated and shared their experience so in such a wonderful and powerful way here. Then finally, like I said, it was typically after finding the community that people said they pinpointed down their specific stereotypes. And one participant shared that experience here. Then somehow it clicked once I saw the raccoons begin to climb a tree. I thought it was a pretty good climb and I wished I could join them. Maybe these are my people? The raccoons, seeing them move, act, all the little things hit me like a ton of bricks. It was like when a math problem finally clicks and you can solve any variation of it anytime. Everything made sense. Okay, so the next kind of broad topic of results is lived experiences. These were kind of day-to-day therianthropic experiences that people described. The first and most commonly described of which was species dysphoria. 6 out of the 7 participants talked about experiencing species dysphoria. And Joe talks about that a little bit here. This was in response to the prompt asking about a low point. So they said definitely species dysphoria. How it developed, I'm not sure about, besides me literally being in the wrong body and in the wrong place. It's something that's kind of been part of me since birth. I address it by trying to not think about it and distracting myself with other things to take attention away from it. It's the single biggest complication of everything, the single biggest problem with therianthropy, and the single biggest reason I don't think it's all just a delusion. The feeling is very real and very visceral and always guarantees moments of existential horror. It permeates every moment and creeps into every occasion. Although a lot of the time I'm distracted enough that it doesn't influence what I'm doing. But most of the time, I have to constantly take precautions, such as trying to avoid thinking about certain things, not go near mirrors, not be consciously aware of myself. Another common lived experience that came up was this idea of social obstacles, which was having difficulty relating to or interacting with human social norms. And also related to this was this idea of feeling like you're wearing a human mask when interacting with humans, and the sort of feeling of relief of getting to take off the mask and when you're able to act in more natural, non-human kinds of ways. So Alex shared an experience of difficulties with human social norms here. I never used the correct sort of body language when I communicated, and I was practically incapable of reading it on other people. It was a wall where I only had words, so sarcasm was utterly lost to me. Still have issues with it. I think this was largely due to me being wired for different body language of the stereotype variety, or something. I had been attempting to communicate with other human beings using body parts I didn't have, expressions I couldn't use. To express apology, I couldn't just tuck my ears and tail. I had to use this human face to do it. I had to stand the right way, look the right way, as humans would do. It was as if my brain had to be rewired entirely just to be on the same level as my peers in conversation. So another common experience, probably unsurprising, that came up was shifts, both phantom shifts and mental shifts. Interestingly, phantom shifts were more often regarded with positive emotions and positive experiences. In particular, people talked about how they could be really helpful in terms of pinpointing a stereotype. And here, Ray shares a positive phantom shift experience that they had. I then felt something very distinct on my face and my arms. Phantom paws slash arms covered my own, and I had nearly a full phantom head. I became extremely excited and happy because I hadn't had a strong phantom slash mental shift in quite a while, and it's usually fun. In contrast to that, mental shifts were actually more often regarded with negative emotions, um, such as like fear or just any kind of more negative experience. I thought it was really interesting the way that there was that emotional distinction between the two types of shifts. And here's an example of that with Heket sharing an experience of being bullied. A few boys were making fun of me. I don't remember if they were physically threatening or what, but they must have been threatening in some way because I tried to roar at them and scratched one with my nails. I can't say I was thinking much, it was just kind of like an instinct took over after the thought of get away from me, and I was feeling some mixture of anger, frustration, and sadness, loneliness, etc. So the last lived experiences kind of sub theme that came up was feeling a connection to nature. And here's a quote of someone sharing that and how that um, felt particularly relevant to their therian identity. We had gone on a day trip to a set of waterfalls that you can swim in and slide down. After having spent most of the day around other people who had also come to enjoy the waterfalls, we headed downstream a bit to see one especially large fall. We left all of our stuff back where our canoe was and headed down the river barefoot in nothing but our bathing suits. I remember feeling so invigorated because I was surrounded by trees and sunshine and water, and the fact that I was moving through this environment as a unit with people that I cared about made the whole experience a little surreal. I could easily imagine us all as wolves moving through the forest instead of humans. We climbed up and down rock faces, swam across the river and a few large ponds, and up and down the rock falls. I lost myself in the joy of it all. We were doing something that a lot of people would consider pretty dangerous, all things considered, but it felt so natural and so right. I can still remember how everything smelled that day because every single one of my senses was just so in tune and aware. It really was just awesome. Okay, so this is the last major section of results, which I call attributions to therianthropy. Essentially, this was when people would attribute non-therianthropic experiences to their therianthropy or therian identity. And this was in many ways the most exciting part of the results because it directly related back to McAdams's identity model. You might recall that his model states that people interpret and reinterpret their lived experiences to create a cohesive narrative that serves as the identity. So this theme of people attributing non-therianthropic experiences to therianthropy fits in the model in terms of people interpreting their experiences in the context of therianthropy and how that may serve to further reinforce that therian identity. And I have some quotes about this as well. So, for example, Alex shared that their connection to the natural world they attributed to therianthropy. They said, I feel that therianthropy allows me to have a more personal connection to the natural world than I otherwise would. Another participant talked about how therianthropy had influenced their political views. They said, I definitely think that my therianthropy has at least a little bit of an influence on my political views, and that ties back to the idea of animals seeing things in much simpler terms. Gray also shared about how they felt therianthropy had affected every part of their life. They said, if I had to pick out a theme from everything that has been said today, I would say it is that therianthropy touched every part of my life, even parts I wouldn't necessarily think it would. Therianthropy can shape and affect life in very profound ways. And then finally, this last quote, a participant really kind of hit McAdams's theory, right? Like I feel like this is so cool because it just beautifully illustrates this entire concept behind McAdams's model in terms of it being the interpretation of an experience that matters to the identity rather than the objective experience itself. So they said, I might just be a curious human or a handsy human, but I attribute it to therianthropy, and I guess that's where the distinction comes in. I, for whatever reason, attribute touching things as a raccoon behavior when other human beings just consider themselves hands-on. So that's the end of the results. Overall, the results really kind of fit in line with the existing research discussed earlier. We saw this process of continuous evaluation and reevaluation of experiences described in McAdams's model, and there were similar themes as those found by Gribble and colleagues related to self-discovery, species dysphoria, and social alienation. Um, as I said before, for me doing this study was really, really meaningful because I was able to use research to put into words experiences I had been so familiar with as a member of this community. And since completing this, it's been downloaded and read literally thousands of times, and I've gotten some good feedback on it. And it really warms my heart to feel like I'm contributing something meaningful to this community that means so much to me. So with all of that said, I'm gonna shift gears to talking a little bit about my current research. I've been fortunate to be able to continue pursuing non-human focused research in my dissertation. This is just going to be a sort of basic general overview because the research is still in the really early stages and a lot of details aren't really hammered out yet. Things might change, but I did want to share the general topic with you all because it's something I'm really excited about. So, the focus of my dissertation is going to be to look at the intersections of non-human gender and autistic identities. As I kind of alluded to earlier, and as I've seen again come up in a bunch of conversations, even just this weekend, I've noticed this really high overlap between trans and non-binary identities and autistic identities within the non-human communities. And I feel like that's probably not a coincidence. I feel like there's got to be something going on there, and I'm really curious about the ways that people interpret those identities and the way people feel like those identities influence one another. Um, there is already a pretty robust and ever-growing body of literature about the overlap between trans non-binary identities and autistic identity. Um, so those two are kind of already known to be linked in some way, and I feel like non-human identity fits in there somehow. I feel like all three of these are somehow related, and I'm really interested in seeing again just how people talk about the way those identities interact with each other in their own lived experiences. So this study is going to look really different than my thesis study, and I just kind of outline that a little bit here. So first of all, it's going to have a much more broadened scope. My thesis study was only on people who identified as therians, and it was only people within that specific emerging adulthood age range. Whereas I envision this study as being people of all kinds of non-human identities, and it encompassing adults of all ages. Then this study is also going to use a mixed method design with both qualitative and quantitative components. So it's probably going to be, or it is going to be, some sort of online survey, but it's going to have both like interview-esque questions, like free response questions about how people feel like their identities influence and interact with one another, as well as some more typical like survey measure type things that I'll be able to like run statistics on. Um, and this is just to be able to get both that really rich level of detail in experience that you can really only get from qualitative research, but also to let me kind of look at people's identities and experiences in a more structured way through numbers and statistics. And then finally, the last kind of key difference is that I'm really hoping to get a large, diverse sample for this study. I would really love to be able to make comparisons between certain subgroups, and I really hope to be able to get a sample that could be viewed as more representative and generalizable to the overall community. I found a lot of really, really cool things and things that, just based on personal experience, I feel like are at least fairly representative of the community in my thesis study. But because the sample size is so small, it really can't like scientifically be said to be representative of anything. So I'm hoping with this study I'll be able to have more of that generalizability and representation of the community. So that's everything I've got. Thank you so much for listening. I've really enjoyed this opportunity to share my research with you all. It's been just such an amazing experience. And I'd now love to open up the space to answer your questions or just generally discuss anything that came up during the presentation. So I'm now going to actually shift my attention to the chat so that I can answer questions. Really appreciate all the positive feedback. Yeah, the participants were really great at just sharing their experiences. If you're curious, obviously that was just only a handful of quotes. In the thesis, there are way more quotes if you're interested in um, seeing more. Okay, yeah. So why I chose that model and were other models considered? Um, yeah. So like I kind of touched on a little bit earlier, I had the opportunity to actually listen to a talk by Dan McAdams, and the way he described his identity model, it just felt like it really jived with the way I'd been seeing people talk about therian identities. This idea that it's the way you interpret the experiences, or at least maybe it's the way you interpret these experiences, that is perhaps more relevant to the identity than the experiences per se. And so I was really interested in seeing if that model would in fact apply to therian identity. And based on my study, I feel like I found some evidence that that did in fact seem to fit the way people were talking about their identities. I didn't really consider other models just because I saw that talk really early on in my thesis process, and it really kind of got the gears turning in my brain for what I wanted to do with the study. So yeah, that's why I ended up doing that one. Okay, let's see. Curious about other identity models. If those identity models can explain your results too. Yeah, I feel like that could be really interesting. It's not something I've personally looked into at this point in my life. I feel like there are a million studies I want to do on therianthropy and on other things. So it's something I'd definitely be interested in looking at down the road. Slash maybe someone else will look at too. And I feel like that would be really cool. What sorts of research would you like to see on therianthropy in this field if it were better funded and more researchers involved? Gosh, like I said, there's basically three main psychological studies on this. So basically, people could do anything, and I think it'd be really cool. As I alluded to with my dissertation topic, I'm really interested in intersectional identities. I feel like there's a lot there, but I'm also really interested in more details of identity development and experiences. I think at some point it'd be cool to get some more, I guess, clinical research going. Look at things like if there are mental health disparities. I I think it's a shame that we have to educate therapists about this as a concept, and especially as someone in the clinical psych field, it's something I really want to fight to raise awareness about. So if we could get more information about mental health and how healthcare professionals can be respectful and help people with therian related issues, I feel like that would be really cool and really important. Um, okay, let's see. You said that something had to be reported by over half the people in order to be included in the timeline. What was the percentage of people who had non-human experiences in childhood? And for those who shared experiences of that time, was it more I definitely felt non-human or more I said I was species and was pretending to be species? So I don't, excuse me, I don't remember off the top of my head the number of people who said that. That information would be in the thesis, if you are curious about that. Um, from what I recall, for those experiences, it was people saying I definitely felt non-human. And when that childhood play came up, at least again amongst my participants, it was very much a theme of um, playing that way felt more natural. It wasn't really about pretending. It was this is when I felt like I got to be myself, kind of thing. Um, how do other identity models differ from McAdams? I'm not sure I understand the significance because I do not understand other models. So there are a lot of different models. Um, Narrative identity models are just one type of identity model, and then even within that, McAdams is only one of those. So I feel like it would be kind of beyond the scope of what we're trying to really talk about here to explain too much of all of that. But essentially, the idea that it is the interpretation and reinterpretation of your experiences into a cohesive life story narrative is what is specific and unique to McAdams. While there might be some other researchers who do similar things, that's sort of the key parts of his model. What responses have you gotten from your thesis by your professors? Yeah, I love this question. So in undergrad, my professors were really on board. In fact, it was my thesis chair who urged me to do the thesis. I did not want to do a thesis. My socially anxious self was not looking forward to having to defend something that sounded scary. But I told her about how I was interested in doing this kind of research, and she just really thought we should do it. So we did it. And then I did during undergrad do a symposium presentation um, on the thesis, really similar to the presentation I just gave. And that was met with positive responses. And then now in grad school, I've similarly gotten supportive and positive responses. In my experience, when I have brought up therianthropy and otherkinity and fictionkinity, in in a serious, confident academic manner, in again, at least with psychology professors, that has always been met well. In that setting, when I've presented it as something serious, that like, hey, this is just an understudied thing and we need to be studying this, people are on board with that and agree. I definitely don't want to say that's necessarily a universal experience. I'm sure there are people who wouldn't be as keen on it, but that has been my experience at the two institutions that I've done this research at so far. Um, okay, bouncing off an earlier panel today, were you there for the original species panel earlier? Slash, do you know anything about people who identify as their own original species? And would you say that helps support the narrative identity model even more, especially in the cases of people who literally create a species biology and culture to fit their own experiences? So I was at the panel earlier today. That was my first kind of big introduction to that topic. I don't feel that I could say if that necessarily confirms this model more or less. I do think it could fit into the model. I think probably all of our experiences could fit into the model, but you'd need to actually do a study to test that out. So I just don't feel comfortable making a claim on that. To what extent can your results be extrapolated to therianthropy overall? So this is sort of the like double-edged sword of qualitative research. You get really rich detail and information that is really, really cool. But because the sample sizes are smaller, you can't really generalize them. Um, so again, it's kind of my personal feeling that a lot of what I found is probably pretty representative just because they are themes I have seen in the community over the last 10 years. But as a researcher, I would need to actually test that and study that. In particular, like I said earlier, I felt like the trajectory I was able to make was really, really cool. But that cannot at all be said to be representative of everyone's experiences. And that is a study I hope to do someday, would be to actually test that against a larger sample and maybe refine it and come up with a real model of therian or non-human identity development. Given your sense of the field, do you see any way forward for helping people to understand their altered human identities that doesn't rely on self-reinforcing narratives? I've always felt like the confirmation bias inherent in this process makes it impossible to assess oneself objectively. Maybe it's impossible. Yeah, so I feel like that kind of depends on how you view these things. Like I said, during my kind of brief overview of McAdams's model, that doesn't necessarily rely on a subjective understanding of the self and reality. So if that kind of interpretation doesn't jive with the way you see things, I don't think it's going to fit with the way you see yourself or your identity. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like I said, I personally like this model because to me, it makes sense based on the way I've seen conversations happen in the community and based on the way the themes came out in my study. But I don't think it's necessarily the only way of conceptualizing things either. Okay, it looks like I've caught up with the chat. We have like 10 more minutes, so feel free to keep asking questions or making comments or anything. Would you be willing to do any studies of fiction kind? Yeah, so like I said, I at least currently envision my dissertation study to include people of all kinds of different non-human identities, and I'm still trying to think through the exact details of how fictionkin will fit into that, given that not all fictionkin identities are non-human. Um, but I do plan on including them in at least some capacity. Again, this study is still very early on in the conceptualizing stage, and I need to still kind of hammer out a lot of those kinds of details. But the goal is to include them, yes. What if one's answers doesn't fit the model? Like I said, this is only one model. I think there are different models, and I also, like I said, this was a very small sample size of therians from almost 6 years ago. I think a lot. I don't. Can you hear me? Oh shit. Um. Okay. Oh dang! Now I lost my train of thought. Anyway, there are different identity models, and it was a small sample size, so it's not necessarily representative. If you didn't feel like the results reflected your experience, I would expect that. It is not going to be representative of everybody. Oh, maybe we have audio again. Yay. Okay, so I answered those two questions via text. I hope you all saw them. So I will advertise for recruiting participants when the time comes, so you can just kind of be on the lookout for that. I can't give you any of the social I'll be advertising on right now, mostly just because I don't totally know.